Right. Hello, everybody. Just give us a minute or two while we get all set up. We'll be starting at about 12:01. And thank you for joining. We're excited to have everyone today. All right, we've got a couple more people coming in here, Donald. So let's give them a
Okay.
second to get settled. Welcome, everybody. If you cannot hear us, well, if you can hear us, just give us a quick hand raise just so we can make sure we're all set up. Thank you, Casey and Armando. Great. As noted, we'll get started here in just a second. We've got a couple more people joining. I am incredibly excited for our conversation today. Just a little housekeeping. We do have a question and answer section of Zoom. So as the presentation goes along, feel free to drop your questions in there or in the chat. We'll periodically take a break and invite some questions throughout the presentation. And of course, we'll have a few at the end. For everyone joining, I just want to do a quick reminder that at improving.com, you can find this full schedule of our virtual lunch and learns that we have every week on Wednesday at 12 p.m. Central. We've got a variety of great talks, some highly technical and some more leadership based. So check out what we've got coming up. We are at time, so I do want to turn it over to our fantastic presenter, Donald Sawyer. Donald's a technical director up in the Minnesota office and is a data engineer and expert in several different areas. He has taught the course Big Data Engineering and Architecture at the University of Minnesota and at St. Cloud University. So you've got a bona fide professor here giving our talk today. So let me go ahead and turn it over directly to Donald to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Emily. Welcome, everybody. I am super excited about this topic, something that we've been working on for a while to get organized and try to make this a kind of a systematic approach to how we do data engineering. And I am going to be focused on DBT today, but DBT is not the core part here. This is something that has been done. We've done it with Java and Python, DBT, SQL, doesn't really matter. So the technology is agnostic, but in order to demonstrate it, I needed a technology to use. So as Emily stated, my background is in this space. One thing I'll call out is my deep expertise is really in test automation, DevOps, and agile practices as they apply to data engineering and data science. And for a lot of people that know me, one of my guiding principles, actually probably should be PLE, but my guiding principles is one test is better than no tests, and that's always. So if you can find a way to get some test work into your system, you're incrementally improving your data pipelines. Today, I'm going to go through four main topics. And this is it's going to cover some advanced things and a lot of new things. So I'm going to actually demystify three types of testing that I'm going to cover today. And the reason is because there's two types of testing that are often thought of as doing the right amount of testing for data engineering, but it's different than what you would normally do in software engineering. So I'm going to talk through the three types, kind of compare and contrast them just a little bit, because I'm going to be implementing three types of testing practices within the framework that I'm going to describe. As a background, I do want to just cover some of the DBT testing features that I'll be using today, because those same features are available in other frameworks and other languages, just might be called a little bit different. I'm going to do a deep dive into what data contract validation is, because there's two parts of that I want to cover that are foundational, because they're best practice. One of them is best practices, and the other one is one that you can use as a best practice going forward. And then I'm going to go into this framework. So the framework and the techniques as part of the demonstration are, how do I take all these things and build them into my workflow so that I don't have to deploy code that's not trustworthy, when I deploy it, and then have to figure out how to circle back and look for quality. We're going to build quality pipeline as we build it. We're going to validate that it's quality through automation. So the first thing here is demystifying some of the testing types. So there's a couple of types of tests that you're going to run into when it comes to data engineering in the data world. One is data contracts. Now, what is a data contract? A data contract is it's a contract between a producer and a consumer about what does my data look like. And for me, over on the right here, you can see it's the format of the data, it's the data structure, the names, the data types, the columns, things. It can also include all sorts of other things. I'm going to be focusing on names of tables, names of columns, and data types. But what we want to do is we actually don't just want to know what those are, we want to validate them. And we're going to validate them two ways. As the data producer, so once I have a contract in place, so this is a written document that is this agreement between the producer and the consumer. And what I'm going to do is once I have that written, the producer is going to write code and make sure that they meet the contract through tests within their pipeline. And that's one of the core things is when you're building to a contract, you should be making sure that you're doing that. But once you have the contract, what's interesting about this is if you have a contract in place, the consumers can actually start their development from as if the contract was implemented because they know the shape. So you can actually start building your reports because you have a contract that's already in place. And so the consumer, though, what they need to do and their responsibility is they actually need to validate that the contract is meeting the constraints that were agreed upon. Because what happens is if somebody violates the contract and you don't know about it, it could break your pipeline. So I'm actually going to implement both of these checks as a part of this process today. And then we're going to talk about data quality and functional validation. Now, this is where a lot of the confusion comes into play with a lot of teams. Is a lot of folks think that they're doing functional testing when they talk about testing in the data engineering space, but what they're actually talking about is data quality testing. And this is testing data that's sitting at rest. It's already in your tables, it's in your databases. And these are things like for validity, for example, you might be testing, oh, if it's a day of the month, then I know that the day has to be between 1 and 31. Or for specific months, it's between 1 and 30. Or for one specific month, it's 1 through 28 or 29. Uniqueness constraints, these are measuring when the data is sitting there, do I have duplicates? I can measure that. So I'm measuring the data as it sits in the table. Another one would be completeness. If there's a required field, is there a null in that field? I should be measuring that when the data gets generated. The other type is functional testing. This is testing the behavior of your pipeline. So it's not testing the data, it's testing the pipeline that generates the data. Is it generating data the way that it's supposed to? So given some data input, when I execute the pipeline, is the output of the behavior correct? I'll just go show a quick diagram here of each to show the difference. So with data quality testing, you can see here I have a data pipeline that's inserting data into a target. Now, not as a part of the pipeline necessarily, it could be separate or it could be a part of the pipeline, but I'm going to have a data quality or set of data quality checks that then look at the data that's in the table and measures the condition of the data that's sitting there. Functional testing, on the other hand, is a little bit different. You're controlling the execution and the inputs and trying to validate the outputs. So what you're going to do is you write test cases. So things like, oh, if the source data is null, what should be my behavior? And you're going to write your code to handle a null coming from the source, for example. So in order to do functional testing, you're going to insert those test cases, those data that represent the test cases, into the source. Then you're going to run the data pipeline, which will then read from the source and put it into a target. Then the third step is you have to validate that what went into the target, is that what I expected it to be? So this is, you have a set of expected outputs and you're comparing that to the actual outputs. And the importance of this one is I'm trying to catch errors in my code versus errors in the data. Couple of quick overview on the DBT testing packages. Sorry, I didn't mean to skip ahead. It's the reason I'm going to cover this is it's important for you to understand the testing capabilities of the framework or the tools that you're using. So for DBT, it's DBT test. For Python, it's PyTest or PyUnit. For Java, it's JUnit, things like that. So you want to understand what features you have available to you. And so I'm just going to explain the ones that we're going to use today in DBT. The way that DBT works is if you have a test, in order to run it, that test is just SQL. And what that SQL does is it selects records that would violate that metric, that test. And so it selects it from the data. If any rows are returned, then that test fails, meaning if I found rows that didn't match my test criteria. If no rows were returned, then the test passes. So for example, if I want to test the not null test of the code column in a table of silver.carrier, the test itself is simply select star from silver.carrier where code is null. So if any carrier codes are null, they will get returned, meaning some of them were null and they weren't supposed to be, so that test fails. The way that DBT handles testing is it has these things called generic tests, which are built in. Uniqueness, so I have all the values within this column should be unique or set of columns. I have the not null, which is I should not have nulls in this column. I have accepted values, like if it's a state code, there should be a list of states that are acceptable. Could be a set of numbers, whatever that might be. And then there's a relationship test, which is, let's say I have a person ID in my table, and then there's also a lookup table that maps person ID to their first name and last name. This one is saying if there's a person ID in my table, I want to make sure that ID is also in my lookup table. Otherwise, you'd have a broken relationship. The next thing are singular tests, which are custom tests. We're not going to write any custom tests today, but the frameworks that we're going to use are all built using custom tests that we get to use as if they're generic tests. In order to run your tests, so this is important as part of understanding your framework, is how do I run tests in DBT? So in this case, I can run DBT test. I can run DBT test and select specific types of tests or filters. But also with DBT, what's cool is if you do a DBT build, what that actually does is it does DBT run. So it runs your pipeline and then runs DBT test after to make sure and measure the quality of your data after it's done running it. So if there's some sort of a data problem, it'll catch it right after your pipeline runs. So that's how DBT testing works. I'm going to be leveraging a couple of packages. The first one is DBT Expectations, which is a port of Great Expectations which is a Python tool or a Python library. So if you're using Python, a lot of the tests that we have in here, you're going to have available to you in Great Expectations as well. And you can use those. But this is a really advanced testing set that makes testing really easy. And this is mostly for data testing. The other package I'm going to use is DBT unit testing, which is how I'm going to do my functional testing. And this takes and it restructures how DBT testing works, and it leverages the DBT testing framework to be able to do that functional testing. And I'll show you, and we're going to go through that and we're actually demonstrate it. And then there's also another one that's more for making sure that you've met standards, and that's called Audit Helper. Definitely recommend taking a look at that if you're using DBT as well. I'm going to go through this section before I get to the framework and the demo. I'm going to stop for questions right after I finish this section, and then we'll jump into the demo. So I do want to do a deep dive into data contract validation, because there's two types of validations. There's one that most folks do, and that is making sure that my code matches my expected data contract, which is great. And DBT actually has this built in now as of 1.5. And what it does is when you build a model, what it does is it compiles the data, it compiles the model, figures out what its contract is, so the model that it generates, and it compares it to the data contract that you defined in your YAML file, which we'll show as well. And if it matches the contract, it's fine. The test passes and it runs the model. But if you violated the contract, if your code violates the contract, the test fails and it won't run your model. Because what it's saying is you wrote code that does not meet the expected contract that was agreed upon, you cannot run this code. So it just stops it. And you can set those to warnings and things as well, but I like to keep them as failures. So for example, here's a data contract. I've got a table, it's got the columns code, and it's got a data type of character varying. And I've got this model. I've got the SQL code that is the transformations. And what DBT is going to do is DBT is just automatically going to verify that this, the output of this when it compiles it, so it's going to fill in all the variables and compile it, and it's going to say, is code a character varying? Is the state country a character varying, for example? And what it's checking, and the way that you do this is the config block you add to your models. That's it. Very little testing to get all this contract validation. Helps you get to that best practice with 3 lines of code. The config, the contract, enforced equals true. And then every time you add a column into your contract, so this is my written contract, it's going to validate your output is matching that. So here's an example of a failed model. In this case, it's selecting code and empty string description. Well, code will pass as long as code's a character varying in the source. But this one is a string, and that's fine, but it doesn't have a name. And so it's not going to output name as the column name. It's actually going to say, I don't know this column, I don't know the name of it, and it doesn't match. I'm missing name from my compiled model. So the fix there would be select empty string as city. Now this contract will pass. Now, functionally, is this model correct? Probably not, because you're probably not selecting empty strings. This is where the functional testing comes into place. Like, how do we know that what was selected for city is correct? So that's how the model contract is going to work. It's going to compare the output of this model to the definition in this contract. There's another type of data contract validation that I've been using more and more, and I call it data contract pre-validation. As many of you probably have had before, you've got data that you're sourcing and selecting from. And let's say they say that it's a string. And then all of a sudden, someday, that column name changes, or they change it to an integer, and your pipeline breaks and you had no idea. Well, when you run your pipeline, that's, to me, the wrong time to catch an issue with data that you're sourcing, especially if there was a contract in place. So what I do is I actually build checks on my sources, and I label them with what's called a pre-check. And then I call the DBT test for the pre-checks and just do a pre-check before I run my data pipeline. I say, hey, are all my sources meeting the contract that I expect? Because I don't want to run my pipeline if there's a violation. You probably heard the term garbage in, garbage out. Well, if I get garbage in, I don't want garbage out. I want it to stop. And that's kind of the point of pre-check validation. And the way that I'm going to do some simple ones in here, there's going to be really easy tests to write. Part of the whole point of this presentation is we can do this in a very quick and easy manner. I'm going to make sure that the columns that I want exist on the sources. So what I'm actually going to do is every time I have a new source column, I'm going to add the check. Now, what you might also want to do is you might want to add in checks for, I want that column to be an integer, or I need it to be an integer or a date, because if they change that, it could break my downstream pipeline. And so you can add these tests as a part of it too. And one of the things with DBT expectations is there's a ton of different tests that you can have. They're super configurable. I use all different types depending on what type of test I want to run. But I'm going to be using the expect column to exist one in the demonstration. Now, how do you do tag these pre-checks in DBT? So in DBT, I just label, in this case, I'm saying pre-check is at the source level. So all sources, all the tables are going to run all their tests because they're all labeled as pre-check. This cascades down. I don't like that because I might have tests on my sources that I don't want to be a part of the pre-check. And so what I would normally do is I'm going to actually add the tag at the test level and say, hey, as a pre-check, I want you to make sure that the column exists. So always run this test. And then when I do my pre-check, it's only going to run the tests that have this tag on them instead of just every test. All right. That's the quick background. I know I covered a number of things, the 3 testing types and data contract deep dive. I'm going to stop and just ask if there are any questions in the chat right now that I could address.
We don't have any questions in the chat, and I don't see any hand raised, but if anybody has anything you want to jump in with, we can take a quick moment here. I think we're good to move on.
Okay. Well, now we're gonna move really fast because we're gonna get deep into code. We're gonna look at a lot of different things here, and we're gonna look at this process that I used to get. How do I build data contract tests, pre-validations, data quality tests, and functional tests into my pipeline so that when I deploy, I don't have to circle back and do this. The whole point of this framework that I'm going to show you is what I found is trying to add in contract and data quality tests and unit tests after I've already deployed the pipeline become really hard because it's hard to determine all the tests that I'm going to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to leverage work that we've probably already done in order to write these tests because the information is fresh in our mind. So this framework, if you attended my talk in July, if you didn't, go ahead and I do have a link here. but I did a talk on how do I build the right products, and then how do I build them right. And there's this part in there called insight mapping that we use. And what it comes down to is we collaborate with the business to understand what it is they want us to define. And then as a technical team, we start to define domain and these data contracts. We define data models, data dictionaries. We start creating documentation, and we're capturing metadata about our data that we're going to generate. And then we can map that to the data set. So we're going to have these outputs of designs. These designs that we have a data model, a data dictionary, and a data mapping. These three types of documents are crucial to doing a really good job in following this process, because this is all the information. These are all just captured from conversations you're having with your business. Most of you, when you're going to write a transformation, you have to figure out like, what's the mapping and what are my rules? And you might be trying to understand the data better and do an exploratory data analysis and working with your business to better understand the requirements. Well, while you're having those conversations, if you're building these artifacts, the next step is going to be a whole lot easier. And here's the process. Now, this process was developed so that we can fit data engineering into an Agile process, but also have high quality output. So being a part of Agile is not just ripping through code as fast as you can. It's actually doing high quality iterations. And for me, when I look at this, understand that I'm doing this one column at a time. So this demo, I'm going to do all of these things one column at a time. But what I'm hoping that you'll get out of this is that it's really not that much added work. And when I'm done, I've got a fully tested high quality product that I can trust. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the design documents that we have, and I'm going to use a data mapping, and I've kind of combined the data mapping and data dictionary document together. That's going to be the input into this process. And we're going to go ahead and walk through this piece by piece. So defining the data contract, I'm going to write my contract in code. We'll do that in DBT. We're going to map the source dependencies, which I've actually already pre-mapped them for the demo to make it a little bit easier, but on the slides, you'll see the mappings. Then I'm going to add, because I know that I have a source dependency and I've added that to my source file, I'm going to add the pre-checks to that source. So I'm going to add the test to say, if you send me garbage, here's the checks that I want. Here's the checks I'm going to have to validate or to make sure that you're not sending me garbage. Then I'm going to add functional unit tests. Then I'm going to implement the actual code that does the transformations. And you can do these, you can do the implementation first and then the unit test. I do it this way because I prefer test-driven development. And this process fits really well with that. And then there's one more step here. You're not really done, because what happens is as you go through this process, you start to learn more about your data. So you might have some new data quality constraints that you're like, you know what? I probably need to add a check maybe for the max value or something around the nulls or something. And we're going to show this, but this is the time that you would add those. You would say, you know what? I learned a lot. I'm going to recircle back and make sure that my data quality checks of all the tests that I wrote, make sure that I have them all covered. And then there's this last step, which is the regression test. Now, for those of you that don't know what a regression test is I'm actually going to run my actual code, and I'm going to run all my tests and make sure that as I add a new feature, I didn't break any other features. And as you go through this column by column, you're going to add one column at a time. And every time you add a column, you add functionality, and you're also making sure that you didn't break anything that was existing. Because going back and testing all this all at once is very time consuming. So I'm just going to do it as I code, and then I don't even have to go back and do any manual testing. The use case that I'm going to use is airlines data, and these are actually airline carriers. So I've got a carrier table as input. It's in the bronze schema in my database, and I have a Postgres database that I have up and running, and I'll show you. And if you want to use this demo, I have the instructions for also running it yourself. It's got two columns, code and description. And the format of that description is there's a carrier name, and then at the end, there's a parenthesis, a from year and a to year, which is the effective from and 2 years for that carrier's name. Because so carriers change names over time as they merge. So they have effective dates for when those are valid. We're going to output our contract. That's output's going to go to the silver schema, and it's going to have a bunch of columns. It's going to have the carrier code. It's going to have the carrier name, the effective from year, the effective 2 year, and then the original description for troubleshooting purposes if there's an issue. But this is in the silver, so we're okay having the original description there. But the whole point is we're going to parse this data so that it's actually something that we can use. So here's what it looks like. In our bronze data, here's an example of some codes and some descriptions. And you'll notice here, the first one is kind of happy path. When I parse this out, I get carrier 1A, 2016, 2020. The second one, notice I'm missing the from year. So if you're missing a from or a to year, it becomes null. And then the last one is bad data. This is garbage data. This is bad data. We're going to let it go through the silver zone. We're not going to let it go through to the gold zone, which we're not going to hit the gold zone today. We won't have time. But the rule here is if you cannot parse this, then the name should just be equal to the description. And then for the effective to and from year, you just set those as -1, because then you know, like, this was not parsable. I'm not able to determine what the from and the to year is. Okay, so that's our use case that we're going to build today. And of course, I've gone through and I've created my data mapping document. This is a simplified version of something that we do. But what you're doing is you're defining this first 3 columns are the data dictionary. It's what does the business refer to this field as? What is the actual field going to be in my table or my view? What is the data type? And then the mapping part is where do I source that data from? And it might be one, in this case, it's 1 column. In your world, and in some tables, it might be multiple fields, however you need to do that. But as you're going through and doing this mapping and figuring out how to fill this out and get this information, you're going to learn things about your data. And that's where these rules and notes come in. I know that this is just taking the code, bringing it in, but there can't be any spaces, so I know I have to trim it. But these also cannot be null because this is a required field. So I'm writing those rules and those notes as I figure out how to build out this data mapping and data dictionary. I'm actually logging those rules because these are going to turn into tests at some point. All right, let's get started. So the first item in that table was the carrier code. Okay, so I need to define the data contract. So here's the contract. It's the column name is code. It's a character varying of type 8, and we'll get to it. Since it's a straight pull, that means that if there's a carrier code in the source, there's a carrier code in my target. So I know that count between whatever carrier codes were in the source, that count should be the same. I should have no nulls and no spaces. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the code. And I've pre-written all the code so that it goes a little bit quicker. But you can see I have 4 files open up here in my Visual Studio Code. I have my data contract file, which is my YAML file. Okay, so I'm going to put my contract in there. And what you can see here as I'm enforcing the data contract, I've stated that the row count should be the same as my source table. I'm also saying, so here's the name of the column that I'm adding. It's data type. And one thing I'll note is the number here does not get validated. This is not something that gets validated. You have to do that there's a different step for that. And then I'm adding in these other tests. Where did I get these tests? Notice how these are not extravagant tests, but these are the core critical tests that I determined were necessary as a part of my pipeline. It can't be null because it's a required field. It also can only be numbers and letters. So I have a regular expression. I'm using DBT expectations regular expression test to say, is this only alphanumeric? There's my contract. So now I've written my contract. Now, every time I write code, it's going to make sure that the code that I wrote is actually meeting this contract. Okay, so we have a contract. So that's good. Next step, we need to map the source dependencies. Okay, so in my mapping, I'm mapping the code to bronze.carrier code in the code field. Okay, so I know that I've got this mapping. So what does that mean? That means, I've gone through this data mapping process. Well, that means that there better be a code field on carrier code. So we're going to actually build that mapping. So here's my definition of my sources over here. So I've got carrier code. I'm going to go ahead and just add that in to my sources here. Okay, so what have I added here? I've said, okay, in the bronze schema, there's a carrier code table, and I'm actually setting the pre-check at the table level because all my tests are going to be pre-checks in this case. I'm saying for that code, none of them should be null. If any of them are null, stop the pipeline. Don't even run it. And then if that column doesn't exist, you also should stop the pipeline because it's not going to run. So I've now implemented my source pre-checks at this point. Again, one thing I want you to note is these are not extravagant tests. I'm not writing a ton of code to do this. And they're things that I already know because I've done the data mapping as it is. These are all things that are common to me because I've already gone through the analysis. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add the tests, the functional tests. Now, this is where in DBT, I'm not going to go through how functional tests work in DBT unit testing. I'm not going to go through fully end to end how that works because that would take about 15 minutes in and of itself. But I will describe what we're putting in here. So on the left, you see two things. This is, I'm mocking my data source. I'm mocking the carrier code, and I'm saying, don't use the real carrier code table. I want you to create an in-memory table in place of carrier code, and here's the data that I'm going to put in. And then what it's going to do is it's going to run your DBT pipeline model. When that model runs, the data that's in the expect is it's saying, I expect these to be the results. And it's actually going to compare what actually got output to what's in this expect block. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just paste this in and let's walk through the test cases. So for carrier code, here are my test cases. Now, some people are like, well, why do I need to do this? Well, the reason is because for your data testing, what if you don't have these two scenarios where I got an empty carrier code? What if I don't have in any of my data, I don't have a case where there's a spurious space at the beginning of the code, or in this case, at the end of a code? I still want to make sure that my pipeline handles those correctly. And what should be the output given these input test cases? I should end up with only ones that are valid and all the spaces should be trimmed off. Now, what's really nice about this is this was really easy to write these test cases because I only had to think about what are the test cases for the carrier code column itself. The reason that a lot of folks get hung up on this is they've got 50 columns that they're trying to figure out the test cases for. Well, at this point, I'm only worrying about what are the possible scenarios for a carrier code. I don't have to think about it. All that other stuff is noise right now. I just want to make sure carrier code is correct. I'm going to go ahead and save this test. I'm actually going to run this test right now. So I'm going to go ahead and run this test. Now, in order to run the unit test, so at the bottom here, you'll see I have dbt test -- select tag unit test. It's going to run my carrier model. Now, my carrier model has no code in it. It's just a straight select. It doesn't do anything. You have to have a model for it to be able to run something. So I've got this blank one. So I'm going to run my unit test. Now, if you wrote unit tests and you didn't implement them in the model or the transformations in the actual code yet, all of your tests should fail. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that all of my tests fail. So what this is doing is it's inserting these records into an in-memory table, and then it's going to run my pipeline, and then it's going to make sure as an output that these are the records that are output. And it is taking its time. I do have my database up, I would assume. Yes, I do. Yes. So we have our database up. Here we go. I guess maybe I shouldn't have rebooted right before this presentation. All right. So it's running the silver carrier test right here. And okay, you can see, all right, so first of all, it doesn't have a code column. So that's just not gonna work. So that's gonna be a problem. So let's go ahead, the test failed, and it should. I'm gonna go like this. I'm gonna go select this as code. Okay. Saved it, rerun the test. Now I should still fail, but it should show me the test cases that failed. I'm now thinking that Zoom might be really holding up my performance here. Yeah, it's taken much slower than about an hour ago when I went through this. So we'll wait for that to finish before we go to the next step. If there are questions, do feel free to post them in the Q&A. I guess if we end up waiting like this continuously, we'll probably start answering those questions in between.
Yeah, no questions yet.
Okay.
Then, as noted, you can drop them in the Q&A section or the chat if you prefer directly. We also have everyone by default on mute, but if you would prefer to ask your question in person, go ahead and raise your hand and I'll unmute you.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so you can see what's really cool about this package is it's saying, I found this record. I did not find these records, these bottom three. So the functional unit test actually failed for my test cases. So what you do at this point, this is how test-driven development works, is now that I've done that, now I'm going to actually write my actual code. It's called fixing the test. So I'm going to write the code so that my test will pass. And in this case, I've already written that, and I'm going to go ahead and hopefully this starts to fire up a little bit quicker. And at this point, I should see my test pass. And what am I preparing to do for the next step? So we'll wait for that. What am I preparing to do next? I've implemented the model. Now I'm going to also end up adding some of the missing data quality checks. And those missing data quality checks, if you think about this, what was the design decision that we made in here? We said, well, if it's an invalid code, I'm going to filter it out. Well, I wrote a data quality test that said the count in the silver.carriers table should be the same as the source table. But that's actually not going to be true. What's going to happen is it'll have fewer records if you filter out the bad ones. So we actually need to add a new data quality check in here. We're just going to actually refine this data quality check. And we're just going to say, hey, only check the count where the trim of code on the source is not empty. Then the two counts should equal. Okay, you'll see here my functional unit test passed. This is extremely good news. That means my feature is functionally tested correctly. Now I want to see if my data quality checks and my pre-checks are going to work. So the final step before I finish off this column is I need to do my regression testing. So I'm going to run my pipeline the way that I would run it in production. I'm going to do a DBT pre-check, and I'm going to do a DBT build, which is actually going to populate data. So the first thing that I do is DBT test pre-check. And get there. Okay, so here's my pre-check. My pre-check command, DBT test dash select pre-check. So that's going to run my pre-checks, which actually I have to have built the model first for this to work. So might get, I think I built the model once already. Well, this is going to be painful if this is going to be this slow. Might have to kill one of my shares, I think. Yeah, without the screen share and recording, this was lickety split fast. So I think my GPU is going nuts. Yep, this one is because I haven't built the model yet, so that's fine. We're going to skip that one. I have to build it first in this case. So the one thing with the pre-check is it's running against actual data. Well, I haven't actually built the model yet. So in this case, I have to build the model first. This is the only time I have to do that, is the first time that I want to run my pre-checks. So this is going to build it. What this will do is when I look over into Postgres here, you're going to see it's going to build a silver schema. So if I refresh this, okay, so I have silver. And then, whoops, I have silver. And then I'm going to have a view called carrier. I'm just going to go ahead and select. I'm going to select the first 100 rows. We'll let that select for a second. Oh, wow. The life of a live demo. Love it. All right.
While we're waiting for that to load,
Yeah.
we did have a question come in.
Yeah, let's go for it.
All right. We have a question from Casey here. What is your take on the cost to run tests in the various cloud options like BigQuery or Snowflake? We have hundreds of data models with over 1,000 data sets. The time and cost to run tests have led leadership to push for fewer tests and removing existing ones.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's not ideal. I think it would be ill-advised. So you do have to figure out the test that you're going to want to write. So sometimes with clients, we figure out what are the high value tests. So some clients, it's like our time, we're going to focus on the core tests, nullability, referential integrity, and valid values we know about. And maybe skip some of the other ones and do those other tests once a month instead of at every pipeline. The one pushback that I usually have against that is, what's the cost if you end up with a data issue? If you're reporting things, for example, to the SEC or the government or some other governing body and you're incorrect, what is the cost of that mistake? If that mistake is in the multiple millions of dollars, I would rather run the tests and eat that cost. Now, from a time perspective, that's where sometimes you might want to look at it and say, I might run the tests periodically and not on every run. But that leaves you open to the possibility that you have bad data and not knowing it until later in the day or whenever you run those tests. So I find it ill-advised to reduce tests if you're worried about time and cost. Or I would rather spend that effort in optimizing and figure out how to optimize them. It's a good question. That one does come up. If you look at the cost, here's the other thing. If you look at the cost of change curve and the time it takes to write tests, that time pales in comparison to the cost of fixing an issue once you find it in production. It's roughly in the 50 to 120 times more expensive to fix it in production once you find it there than to just find it in dev and do it there. So that would be my answer there. And Casey, feel free to follow up on that. I'm going to keep going for a second, but feel free to follow up on that one. All right, so you can see here my pre-checks pass. I'm going to do my build. I did my build and it ran all of my tests, so I'm good to go. So I know that my first column is implemented. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next column. We'll pause in a second because we know we're going to have time to pause. So now I'm going to implement carrier name. Okay, so I have my data contract that I've already defined. So I'm going to go ahead and write in code what my data contract is. And let's see, here's my data contract for, oh, that's the pre-check. Okay, so here's my data contract for name. Okay, so the column is name, it's a character varying, and it cannot be null. Those are the only things about my contract that I care about right now from my data analysis. That's all I care about. So there's my first set. So I've got my data contract. Now I have my data contract developed. Now when I write code, I know that the DBT will check to make sure that I meet that contract. So I'm going to go through the activity of doing my mapping. So I'm mapping it to the description field. So that means since I have the description field and I know that I need that from my source, I need to add that as a pre-check. So I'm going to go ahead and add the description field to my source check as a pre-check. And again, I hope what everybody's seeing while I'm going through this is, yeah, I've already pre-written the code, but I'm not writing oodles of code. Think about the code that I'm writing here. This was 4 lines of code to be able to make sure that my pipeline always has the data that it expects. So now I've written the pre-check for my description. How do I know this is a pre-check? Because the pre-check is at the table level here. So it's always going to run that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run that pre-check just to make sure that that test is being run. And find the pre-check command. There it is. Okay, so there's pre-check. And that's going to make sure now it's just going to say, hey, I'm just going to go look at the data and go, do you even have this issue? Where this is really valuable is when you start development, sometimes you'll say, oh yeah, that field's never going to be null. Great, write it in here as a pre-check. And the first thing you do before you even sit down to write any modeling code is you run the pre-check and say, are there any nulls in there? And if it fails, you go, okay, we thought none of these would be nulls, but it's finding nulls. So we got to go back to the drawing board and go back to design. Again, that cost of change curve. If you find an issue in design, it's significantly less expensive than if you find it in test or production. Okay, so while that's running, I guess we're gonna have to do this in a little bit different manner. So now I need to write the unit test and implement the model for this name column. Okay, so I am changing my model, but at the end, when we're done, we're gonna make sure that I didn't break the previous code I wrote, which is on the code. Okay, so that pre-check's getting ready to run, but I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna put my unit test in and walk through that real quick. Because this Zoom is sucking up 150% of my CPU. So, which is always exciting. Okay, so what did I change in my test here? So in my test, what you'll see here is now I've added a description column on the source, and I've said, look, notice how I added a whole bunch of new test cases. Because what I'm saying is, well, for the description, I have different things for the carrier. Here's a test case where the parentheses are part of the carrier name. Those need to be a part of the carrier name. So that needs to come through. I have other ones that I'm going to use later on, which are I'm missing both years. I'm missing 1 year. Here's one where I have no years. Here's one where I have parentheses, but I don't have a dash in there. That's a fail. That one's a failure as well. So the output for those are, I should only get the carrier names. And for these ones that are 05, those ones are not parsable. So what did I say with the not parsable? That the name should just be the same as the description. And what we'll find is that the from and to years should be -1. So these are the functional test cases. You won't catch these any other way. Most likely you won't catch these types of test cases. Like if this data comes in, it probably doesn't exist anywhere. But if it does, you want to make sure that if that data comes in, that you handle it correctly. What I found with people, with most organizations, is we're not testing all these alternate scenarios, and that's what we're trying to catch here. Okay, so I've implemented the unit test. I'm going to implement the model. I'm just going to do these all in one fell swoop because the resource problem that we're having right now. So I'm going to go ahead and implement the code. So originally, this test, I'm not going to run this one because I know that it's going to fail, but I don't want to wait for it. So this is my stub code. I'm just saying, just select the description or select an empty string as name. What'll happen is the unit testing framework will say, yep, those are all failures because that code doesn't actually follow the rules. Here's the actual code. And notice how gnarly this is. That's fine. I'm okay with writing gnarly code. And the reason that I'm okay with writing gnarly code is if it passes my unit tests, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and say it passes my unit test. I'm just going to move on. Because if my tests are in place, I can go back and optimize and fix this later. But if my tests are in place, I can go and change whatever I want, and the test will catch if I broke something. And that's kind of the key part here is I don't like how this worked, and I actually wrote this code doing this process where I had all the tests written, and I would essentially fix one test at a time until all the tests passed. And then when I was done, I'm done. That's how test-driven development works. But later on, you need to go back and refactor it. Okay, so we're running it here. It's running test silver.carrier. What did I miss? Did I forget to save it? What did I forget? Column description does not exist. What did I do wrong? No. Yeah. I think I added too many description as original description. Something. Okay, well, this didn't save. I didn't save that. Oh, that's because, yeah, I didn't save that, so it didn't insert a description field into the mock table. So that's why that failed. So I hadn't saved it, so it didn't do that. So now we should get a pass. And what we'll find here is we're also going through this process and we're saying, you know, I'm looking at my test cases. So while we're waiting for that, I'm looking through my test cases and I'm like, there's something else I'm noticing here. In my output, my carrier name should always have a value. So I'm going to actually add a data quality test to my data contract and say, you know what? I expect that the value length should be at least 1. It should not be an empty string. Now, you might, but remember, I'm already trimming it, so I only have to check to make sure that it's at least size 1. So I'm going to go ahead and add that check on here. So all I'm adding is a DBT expectations, expect the column value length to be between 1 and infinity. And I'm going to save that as soon as that unit, there we go, the unit test passed. So I know that that gnarly code that I wrote is working. It does what it's supposed to do because it passed all those tests. I added my data quality test, and I know I'm going through this in a little bit out of order, but that's because I need to, order of time. So I added my data quality checks, but now I'm going to regression test. Now I'm going to run my model, and I'm going to do it and make sure that I did not break any previous code that already existed. I want to make sure that all that gnarly code that I wrote, that I didn't break the code column. Okay, so I'm going to do DBT pre-check. I'm actually going to skip that for now because we did already do that. I don't want to wait for my PC here to try to figure that out. But I'm going to go ahead and do my build. So what's this going to do? It's going to compile my models. Then before it runs my model, it's going to make sure that my transformations, the output of my transformations, matches this contract. Then if that matches those contracts, it's going to run my model and generate my silver.carrier table or view with the new column that I just added, which is the description column. And then it's going to run all of my data quality tests that are in here. Are all the values for the name at least size 1? Are any of them null? Are they all, is the code all alphanumeric? And is the code not null? So it's running that right now. And what we'll see when we get over to look at the table, once it finishes, we'll see that the description column is then there. Okay, so you're seeing it's running all the tests right now. Now look at all the tests that I'm running. There's not a lot of code to be able to have all of these tests in my, as a part of my pipeline. I didn't have to write very much tests. It's taking care of it through the libraries that I'm doing. Okay, so if I rerun this, there you go. Now I have my name field. Okay, let's move on to the next item. And we're getting close to time, so I'm going to accelerate this. I'm going to skip the PowerPoint part right now. What's the next step? Now I want to add my effective from year. Okay, so first thing that I need is I need my data contract. Data contract. Okay, so there's my data contract for effective from year. I'm saying that the value of the year has to be between 1900 and 9999. But I only want to check that if I have a valid year, meaning there's times when I don't have a valid year, when I didn't know what the year was and it was null, or when I couldn't parse the string and I set it to -1. So outside of those cases, if you have a year value, then it needs to be between these two values. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this one up. I'm not going to do the last two columns. I think you get the gist of it because I want to show one other thing and leave some time for questions. Okay, so here's the effective from year. I don't need to add any new mappings. So I don't need to go into my source and add any pre-checks because I'm using the same column to get that data. I'm just parsing it differently. So the next thing that I do is I'm going to add my unit test cases. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my unit test cases. We'll quick run through those and then run them. There we go. Okay, so what did I add? I didn't change anything on the source side. It's all the same test cases, but now I'm saying when you parse the effective from year, in the case of 2A, for example, that the from year should be null. In 4A, it should be null. For everything with 5A, B, C, or D, it should be -1 because that was not a parsable string. So those tests, I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to save it. I'm going to skip the running the failed test right now. And I'm just going to go ahead and add the code into the model to expedite this. And then I want to, and then we can kind of start to wrap it up. What did I just do? We're good. Okay. Okay. So I've added the code for effective from year. So now if I were to run the DBT unit test one more time, this would pass. I'm going to go ahead and just do the regression test first. Just because we've got 5 minutes left. And while this is building, so since I'm going to skip the next couple of columns, I'm going to skip ahead here. It's amazing how the slow resources really kills the demo. Should have been able to get through all this, but in the end, I go through this process until the table's done, until I've developed every single thing. But what's important to remember is at the end of every iteration, I'm regression testing to make sure that nothing that I wrote previously got broken. So the question becomes then, okay, so we did all this, are we done? And the actual answer to that is no. Because if you look at this, I said those should be character varying, they're tests. So I did all this testing and it's still wrong. How is that possible? Well, I can fix some of this, but what that means is I need to add another data quality check. And that data quality check that I would add in, which I'm not going to run because it's clearly taking a minute. Okay, so I'm going to rerun. I'm going to rerun, load my data. The data quality check, I can fix that though. So I can actually, if I go to the end, there's another test that I can run, which is in DBT expectations, I can actually add this test in. And what it'll do is it'll say, I don't care that it's like in DBT, text and character varying are pretty much the same thing. But with DBT expectations, it's going to expect it to be exactly a character varying. So I would just add this test wherever I see things that need to be strings. So I would simply put that in, and it's going to say, now this test is going to fail because it's a text, like I showed you in the table. So that one's going to fail, that one's going to fail, and that one's going to fail. Actually, sorry, that one should not be character varying because it's an integer. So if I reran this, you can see effective from year. Okay, we've got that populated. Notice that there's not a lot of missing ones. Like it's really, this is why I use the functional test, because like I would have to find those records to match that, to determine if that test case, if the test for when it's missing a from year was available. Okay. So now are we done? If I added those data quality tests in, no. Because at this point, what I'm going to do is now I have all my test automation in place. I can integrate into a CI/CD pipeline. I know that if I change anything going forward, I can make sure I didn't break anything else. But now I can refactor that really gnarly code that I wrote. Now I can actually make that pretty and make it optimized and make it work better. But the whole thing is I'll make those changes without breaking anything else. So this is where I'm going to stop and ask for questions. While I'm answering questions, I'm quickly going to run one more. Well, actually, I'm going to stop for questions because I'm not going to make any more fixes because it obviously takes 2 minutes for this thing to run for some reason.
Yes, Donald, thank you. We do have a question in and we're at the 2-minute mark. I wanted to let you know Casey had another question.
Okay,
what are your
go for it.
thoughts on threshold types of tests? So
Threshold.
what are your thoughts on? Yes.
Yeah, go ahead. It depends on
This
what you mean by
value
threshold.
in range.
Oh, sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead.
so he
ahead,
wrote
Emily.
here, Casey wrote here. Yeah, so Casey wrote here, this value should be in this range versus growth deviation test. The newest set values is far out of the allowed growth range.
So, okay, so there's kind of two things there. This is where DBT expectations actually has some tests that might actually be able to do that. We've had to write some custom tests for that. My thoughts on that are, if that's a test that you found from your business perspective or that tells you that there's something going awry with the data, you should write the test and build it. Looking at DBT expectations, they might have some range tests that you can use that are also like samples, like actual statistical checks as well. So the range can change over time. But yeah, I mean, we had to do that where we had to say, these two numbers have to be equal plus or minus 1. And so we had to write a special test for that specific scenario. So I don't know if that answered it, Casey. More than happy to take that one offline too. But yeah, if I guess my answer is, if it's something that will tell you that there's something wrong and it's important for you to know it, you should probably write the test, even if it's expensive. If you need to find a way to do it cheaply, I mean, that's what the engineering part of this is. That's where we get away from what I'm doing is very simple and quick and easy, and this is going to get you most bang for your buck. But sometimes it's got to be a value-driven proposition. Other questions?
That was our only open question. Did anyone who is on the call have anything that they wanted to drop into the Q&A section, the chat, or raise their hand for? Quiet group. I think you could take us home, Don.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, first, yeah, sorry about the, I didn't realize Zoom was going to use 150% of my resources while we were doing this, but hopefully this made sense. And, you know, I've used this at multiple clients. This is how I do development whenever possible is I do one at a time. I just make sure it's done because now I don't have to think about it. As soon as you finish and regression test a column, you're done. You don't have to think about it again. And then you move on to the next one. I think a lot of folks struggle when they say, well, now I got to go back and test this. Well, for me, I don't have to go back and test anything. I just move on to the next feature. And I really enjoy that. So, and this thing is finishing the build to make sure that I fix those column values, but we're not going to get there in time. So I do, yeah, appreciate everybody for joining and thank you very much. Hope you all have a good rest of the day.
Thank you all. I'm so glad everyone was able to join. Just a reminder, we do this every week. Next week, we'll be featuring Devlin Lyles as he talks through data and AI. You can check out our recordings too if you're not able to join us here live. Don, thank you again for your time today. This was an excellent presentation, and thank you everybody for taking the time to join.
Yep, thank you. Everyone have a good day.
You do the same. Bye.